C.S. Lewis says Christianity has several components. We walk the road of the Jewish people, but also alongside that are some of the really big pictures that what he calls the landlord put into the minds of the pagans. And from that comes what Lewis calls Mother Kirk. But tied in with this arrangement, almost inevitably, is every few hundred years, Mother Kirk starts to sort of collapse on herself. And the landlord starts to bring the big pictures back, and people start to talk. And from the depths of the ashes, a little green shoot comes, and the church refines itself again. But there's always plenty of drama in the process.
So presumably you think we might be reaching that collapse point now? Welcome to Re-Enchanting, the podcast from Seen and Unseen. I'm Justin Brierley.
And I'm Belle Tindall.
And we bring you interesting guests to talk about the way in which we can re-enchant a secular, material culture with the Christian vision of reality.
Yes, and today we are joined by Dr. Martin Shaw, the magnificent Dr. Martin Shaw, who is, I'm going to give you a nice big bio now. Some people love this, some people hate it, but is a renowned storyteller and mythologist who in the last couple of years has had his own quite extraordinary story to tell. And after many years as a poet, an author and a teacher of others in the West Country School of Myth, Martin has had an encounter that confounded all of his expectations.
You've told this story to me a few times now, Martin. I hope you won't mind repeating at least some elements of it on today's programme. But in many ways, your journey is a homecoming. That's the way you've described it as well. So we're looking forward to hearing that story. But also something that you're working on at the moment, which is the idea of Christianity understood as a dream. So we're going to try and get to all of these things in the course of our conversation. Welcome along to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And we are, of course, here, as ever, at the top of Lambeth Palace Library. You've been able to look outside. It's a bit of a cold, drab sort of day, but it doesn't take away from the grandeur of the surroundings.
Pure Dickensian.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah,
I said Mary Poppins earlier. Oh, that's what it reminds me of when I look out at that skyline. Yeah. But anyway, well, we always begin with the same question. Because we're at the top of Lambeth Palace Library. What are you currently reading, Martin?
Well, I would imagine, like a lot of you guests, I'm reading a few things at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I am reading, and I'm always reading it really, a book called The Way of the Pilgrim, which is a mid-19th century Russian book. It's a novel that was found on Mount Athos and then sort of entered the West. And it's the story of a young Russian Christian who becomes really fixated with the notion of pray without ceasing. Mm-hmm. And it's the Jesus prayer, which in Orthodoxy we use a lot. And it's really the story of all his travails and trouble, trying to find out what that could possibly mean. So that's book number one.
I'm sure we've had a guest who was reading that book in our first season. I can't recall who it was now.
No.
But yes.
But yeah.
What I'm pleased to say is it's out of copyright. So I will be working on a new translation with a friend of mine for next year.
Excellent.
So watch this space.
There you go.
And I suppose along with that, there's a book called the Philokalia, which is a sort of collection of patristic teachings and other stuff that you know, we're big fans of the Bible, but we have the Philokalia as well. So in Orthodoxy, so I've been reading that. And actually, have you ever read Moby Dick?
Yes.
I'm never as well read as
How did you
Belle.
get on with it?
Well, I did it in school, and I'm not sure that's the best context in which to read Moby Dick. I feel like I should do it again for pleasure as opposed to feeling like it's being forced upon me. Because, I don't know, mixed feelings.
Yeah, it's like a men's breakfast gone mad. You know, it really is. It's this extraordinary story of really the dark side of enchantment, being enchanted by a whale, there's a chap called Captain Ahab, I think, who's on the boat with his crew, searching the world for a whale that has wronged him, Moby Dick.
Right.
It's a phenomenal story. It is oppressively masculine. So it's a kind of a one-shot thing. As soon as I've got out of this, I'm just going to read Virginia Woolf for a year, I promise. But as a sort of heart of darkness story, it's very interesting. I mean, I often read it before I'm going to sleep, and various other figures in my mind. Bishop Barron has become Captain Ahab.
And
interesting. N.T. Wright is a chap called, he's called Steelkilt, and things like these various characters.
I love the fact that the whole of the crew is made up of theologians and New Testament historians.
Well, they're out there on the green teeth of the sea, looking for things that other people tell you don't exist. So.
Excellent.
So that's me with the radio.
You have made me want to go back and relook at that now.
I would love to talk to you about it somewhere down the line and see what you think. I go hot and cold with it, but as a writer, it is astonishing piece of work. It's up there with Ulysses by James Joyce and probably Homer's Odyssey. And in my mythological world, you don't get much better than that.
Yeah,
amazing.
That is high praise. Can I ask you a question that I imagine you have spent your entire life answering? So I'm almost apologetic.
Just bring it.
Just bring it on.
Bring it.
What exactly, well, the question's a bit twofold. What exactly is a myth as opposed to just a really rich story? What's the difference? And then therefore, what is a mythologist?
Oh, good question.
Oh, you're very gracious to make out like that was an original question.
Well, it's the right time of day to ask me, because the trouble with Zoom and things like that, people often ask me that at midnight from America, and I'm not so charitable. But I'm caffeinated and I'm ready.
There we go.
So let's think about this. I would say what constitutes a myth, very simply, is a sacred story. So in other words, it's a story that's not just for kicking a football down the road. It's a story that you can organize your life around. And myths, as opposed to fairy tales or folk tales, often have something to do with creation in them. How did we get here? What do we long for? How do we cope with disappointment? All that existential stuff. Myths go down the deep end. They are beautiful stories without the use of facts. They tell deeper truths usually than the facts of the matter. And I recognized even when I was very young that things would happen to me, your first heartbreak, the first time you fall in love. Talking about it on the surface of things does no justice to the absolute deficit that you're staggering around. So myths for me are deep, sacred stories that you can organize you can hang your heart on them. Yeah, that's how I'd say.
The problem, of course, is that myth has, in many circles, taken on a pejorative sort of nature. So when I've interacted with atheists and skeptics over the years, they use it to mean basically irrational, untrue, fairy tale. It's essentially been a stand-in for those sorts of words.
Yes, I mean, obviously you're using my favourite words. So not the untrue bit, though.
Okay.
That's the untrue. This is what I would say. Myth is a wild way of telling the truth.
Okay.
Myth is a wild way of telling the truth. Now, as we go on, maybe we'll get into a little bit of what's different about Christianity and why would someone with the treasury of myth that I've been exposed to for 30 years, why would I make this terribly difficult decision to go down this particular road? But a mythologist, to come back to it, is somebody that is not just a storyteller, but explores the stories on all their different layers, from a psychological to a cultural layer. I taught at Stanford for a long time in California, on and off over 10 years. And that's it's a kind of exegesis. It's a kind of opening the stories up. But what you have to be careful about at the same time is don't tell a story what it is. The moment that you do that, you've shot the bird out of the sky. Every time I see a storyteller who then says, and what the tale means is, if it's too allegorically heavy, you've got a pamphlet, not a story.
Right.
So that's what I'm trying to avoid.
So a lot of it is about, or the power of it is about what to leave unexplained, what to leave omitted, what gaps to leave so that people can be a part of the meaning-making process of receiving a myth.
In myth, especially in the storytelling of myth, you have what you call the sense and the matter. Now, the matter of the story is the A to B to C, but the sense of it is the genius of the teller to know what to flesh out and what to leave dormant. And you normally don't know until you're in the petri dish of the experience, and then you make these split-second decisions. But what's so amazing about oral storytelling is that actually, if I'm doing my job well, I will give you very little because I want your imagination to do the hard labor. And that's the problem a little bit with the Netflix culture and the movies. They're wonderful things, but if I can kind of keep freeze framing John the Baptist, after a while, when I'm reading the Bible, up pops that version.
It fixes a certain version of a story. I think I said this before on this podcast, but when I first read the Harry Potter stories, they sort of, I guess they were my story. When the movies did it, suddenly it imposed that version of the story on my psyche. So that now when I read Harry Potter, I'm thinking of Daniel Radcliffe, not the version. So it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because we love, obviously, the way that we can tell the stories in the modern day. But do you think we've lost something in our modern culture about, I don't know, just something about storytelling that we've lost it with our modern ways of telling?
Yes. Do you know what? We've retained personal narrative. So in every family, there's somebody that's good at telling the stories of their family. There's an aunt or an uncle, So I was on tour in Ireland, and one of the things that you notice is that everybody is a raconteur. Everybody has the gift of making quite magical something that happened on the way to the bus that morning. Now, in a mythically literate culture, you would be able to take a personal anecdote, maybe something that's quite difficult, and you can see how the wingtip of that experience touches a myth or a fairy tale. Could be the story of David and Goliath. But in one way or another, stories help us reach out to the universe. They orientate us and they settle us. But if all you've got is me, if the only temple you serve in is the one that you gaze in all day long, those stories are going to get awfully thinned out. So you end up with a sort of a facsimile or a photocopy of something. 200 years ago, a new story arriving was an event in a village. And the storyteller would come and go, and then we'd all have to remember it. And we'd all remember it slightly differently.
Yeah. And my background and when I get to sort of my geeky sweet spot is New Testament, John in particular. And of course, I've immersed myself. I'd never thought of myths and myth making and myth reception. But of course, that's a completely orally literate culture, a totally different way of crafting, telling, receiving, memorizing stories. It's so beautiful because it touches almost like sites of remembrance.
That's it. That
you can't do with words, that you literally have to leave gaps for people to do that.
No storyteller would have got through the Gospel of Mark without going, that's a storyteller. And then, and with all the Gospels, as I think I said this before, Justin, what's so amazing about them is they have postcodes. They have addresses. They're not floating off in some Gnostic universe. The trouble is here. It's by this lake. It's by this village. And that's very much, Tom Waits says, a song needs an address. A song needs an address to anchor it. And stories do too. That's the gold in all stories, is when you have a tree or a river that isn't just universal, it's site-specific. And
yet somehow that very site-specific story has obviously been universalized. It has gone well beyond its original postcode and been sort of engaged, interpreted and understood by people of many different generations, cultures and places.
Well, there we have it. The Great Commission. Off it goes.
Off it goes.
Yeah.
Look, it's interesting hearing you talk about this way, about the Bible, because you were familiar with the Christian story, I guess, from a relatively young age. I think you grew up in a Christian family, but you didn't necessarily call yourself a Christian until relatively recently.
No, I absolutely did not call myself a Christian. I wouldn't have dreamed of calling myself a Christian.
Do you mind telling the story?
No, absolutely. I mean, so I grew up in actually a pretty healthy church. It's a Baptist church, Upton Vale, down in Torquay in Devon. It's still going, packed houses. But it was a church where a lot of the drama was taking place in the pulpit, not the altar. I was not really aware of a contemplative tradition. I didn't really know what saints were. Monks were something from Robin Hood. And really everything was, as I said, sort of sermon orientated. The charisma of the teacher had a lot to do with it. And I could see that that was working for the adults in the room, but I would have this fantasy that, you know, the window would be burst open, Aslan would come in, create mayhem, and some fresh air would come into the place. So my father, who was and is a terrifically good preacher, my brother's a pastor, my sister is this kind of Catholic powerhouse over in Walsingham, amazing people, but it did not touch me. I have a mystical heart and I like mysteries and I don't need everything stretched on the rack of exegesis. And so by the time I was about 17, I left the church and quite honestly, I was receiving more nourishment from myths and stories than I was Western evangelical stuff. And even as a child, I remember thinking the figure in the middle of this centrally heated middle-class room is this scandal of a human being. Christ was born, as I recall, he's already being searched for. You know, he dies an outlaw. He's born with, you know, Herod looking for him. How did I not get the countercultural vitality of this figure? It had been sort of bled out. So I go walkabout, really. And so I end up, believe it or not, living on a hill in a tent for 4 years. Unconsciously, I think, trying to get in touch with the soulful life that Christianity didn't seem to quite offer me at that point. I become a mythologist. I become a storyteller. I'm looking to have a soulful life. But to be honest, the one place I didn't think I'd ever have to look again would be in the tradition of my youth. However, that doesn't mean that I didn't stay in good relations with my mum and dad and my brother and sister, who are all very keen Christians. But you can imagine a hiatus of, you know, 30, 35 years. That's a pain in a Christian family where, you know, off I wandered.
So you were sort of wandering. You were on the side of a mountain for a few years. You were having vigils in the forest. You were establishing this sort of career in mythology, storytelling, the West Country School of Myth and so on. And in a sense, I guess you were feeding your soul through that whole period. You were kind of learning what it means to live in this kind of world of myth and imagination and so on. Was there any clue at any point that this might bring you back in the direction of Christianity, or was that almost a complete surprise?
It was a complete surprise. I think what I learned in retrospect from all the myths that I studied was incredible pictures about the experience of living, the travails we go through, the genius of the human spirit, the cosmologies that have been built all around the world. But what I didn't have was a centering image. I didn't have a figure as strange as Christ. I found it much easier to relate to someone like Beowulf, a kind of heroic figure, than this last shall be first character that's wandering around. He seems thin-skinned. He seems under pressure. He seems incredibly, and this is a word you won't hear on the program very often, shamanic. He's a shamanic figure. He really is. And by the time you get to the crucifixion, that is, if for those that know what shamanism is, this is it, but in its exaltation. This is what it was always pointing towards. But I didn't know that when I was in my 20s or 30s. I'd had an experience where I had met a Lakota Sioux medicine man called Wallace Black Elk, a healer. Ironically, he was on a lecture tour over here. And it was a day rather like this one. The weather was like this. And for various reasons, a long story, we needed to heat some rocks up. And so we had this fire going. We were going to go into something called a sweat lodge. It's like an incredibly hot sauna. And the clouds come over and I know they're going to rain. And I said, Grandpa, it's going to rain. And he said, maybe. He gets his pipe out. It's a thing called a chanupa. And he aims it at the clouds. And for about 10 minutes, he speaks to that cloud formation as if he's being reunited with a girl he loved when he was 16. tenderly, inventively, sweetly, he courts clouds. And I was watching this as a 23-year-old thinking, I think this is the first human being I've ever seen. This is a real person. He's doing something that's utterly irrational to everyone else, but he felt so connected to the world around him, he could negotiate.
Wow.
And then to my horror, he said to me, I don't even come from here. Come on, kid.
Like as if they're your neighbours.
Now, I don't know about you, but when I was 23, my mouth was a place where words went to die. They were a kind of prison cell. I trafficked in sarcastic language. The rite of passage of becoming a grown-up in those days was to speak in a sort of rather embittered, caustic tone. And he was saying, no, beauty matters. So from that point onwards, I was very interested in the notion of how do human beings get made? How do we get made? What constitutes a soulfully alive human being? And then, to my astonishment, 20 years on from that, this Galilee druid provides the route, which I didn't have. You see, I had plenty of atmosphere, but I didn't have that centering point that I have now.
I mean, firstly and foremostly, did it rain?
No.
Wow.
Absolutely did not rain.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Did you find yourself, I remember we chatted to Paul Kingsnorth, who in very many ways is your spiritual doppelganger. And he said that, you know, because he did, I think, Buddhism, didn't he? And then he did Wicca, and he found himself wanting to worship something, like something, someone. Did you find that as well?
Yes, we all worship something. Where I think wherever we give our most focused attention, it becomes holy almost, which is dangerous in a sense. You've got to be careful what you're looking at and what you're filling yourself with. I've known Paul for a long time. Oddly, our moves into Christianity, although from the outside they look like two horses at the same time, we didn't communicate a great deal amount.
No way.
No,
wow.
no, it's odd. It's odd. We do now.
Yes, yeah.
Yes. Well, we've heard Paul's story. Tell us what happened with you, Martin, because there was a sort of interesting defining moment in your journey.
There was. So one of the things that I've been doing since that moment with Wallace Black Elk many years ago is I became something called a Wilderness Rites of Passage Guide, which is a 4-day and night fast in a wild place. Lots of Christians do it. People interested in the early Christians. You go to a place, you empty yourself out, you listen and you pray. It's very simple. Well, I've done a lot of that. So it got to the end of 2019 and I decided to do a 101-day vigil, 101 days. The reason it was so long was I knew that emotionally I would go off the idea after about 20 days. And it was a lesson in fidelity. I wanted to see if I could keep coming back. And the lintel of how I felt was not what I was going to regard as the barometer. I was just going to keep turning up to an old English forest where I would listen to it. I know it sounds odd. And I also wanted to tell stories, be quiet, be in that place. And this extraordinary thing happened on the last night that I would imagine for the rest of my life I'll be turning over and hopefully never quite understanding, never quite being able to tell what it is. It's the final night. The whole process has been much, much more arduous than I expected. And I elect to do an all-night vigil in the middle of the forest. And this is just the tying of the bow. There's nothing expected at this very late stage. I've had moments of insight. I've wept over my past life, all of this kind of thing. But I go up into the forest where there's actually the remains actually of an old Iron Age fort, very cold. It was about -5, I remember. And I'm sitting there in my big North Face parka, just down on the ground, waiting for this thing to end. But it is a night of prayer, because I've always prayed. It's just a little specific as to quite what I was praying to, but I knew it was a good idea to give thanks. I am used to being in forests at night. And what that means is you get used to the sound of animals in a forest. So your vision is always horizontal. You're looking for, or listening for the movement of a stag or a fox. And I don't know why this happened. but my attention was brought upwards. I wasn't looking on the horizontal anymore. I looked up into the sky. It was one of those beautiful nights where those little kind of pale blue stars, hundreds of thousands of them. And I said something along the lines of, I'm at the end of this experience of duress and bliss. And if there's anything you really need to show me, this would be a time. And then this thing happened where I look up and I can see one star that's not colored like the other ones. It's not pale. It doesn't look like a normal star. It's a beautiful collision of colors, almost like the aurora borealis. Not quite. And I think, that's weird. It's getting bigger. And it's moving quite quickly. What I'm describing to you takes place over, seconds, really. And then I think, goodness me, it's sort of falling out of the sky and it's taking a shape. And the shape the thing took was, it was a bit like the tip of an arrow. It was like that, with these colors across it, these beautiful sort of etheric colors. And I suddenly realized it was going to land just into the ground about 15 yards to my right. And it did. And it was utterly silent. It was utterly silent. There was no sound, just through the woods into the ground. It wasn't frightening, which is strange because you can get some spooky stuff out in the woods in the wee small hours.
Yeah.
I can imagine.
This was absolutely not like that. This was properly Old Testament. And I thought it at that time, which was my only concern, was that something so extraordinary had happened that it would be no problem for me at all for somebody to come along and explain it away scientifically. I wouldn't be upset by that at all. I know what I know and I know what I saw, and it happened at a particular moment. So just to reiterate, I pray, I look up, and out of the sky falls this beautiful painted arrow of colors and just disappears into the ground of the forest. It's gone. There's no smell, nothing. I was so thrilled and heartened by it. I danced for the rest of the night, and I'm no kind of dancer, just like a shuffling dance, old middle-aged man dance, know. And then I walked back down the hill to the cottage where I lived, and I got into bed. And as I was getting into bed, suddenly 9 words forced themselves into my mind. I had no control over it. Inhabit the time and genesis of your original home. Inhabit the time and genesis of your original home. Again, there's a bump in that. I still don't quite know what it was, but I knew I didn't like the word Genesis. I knew that was very odd. Yeah. And with that, I fell asleep. And for 18 months, I ruminated because the next day, lockdown began.
Wow.
If only I'd synced them up, but I didn't know it was going to happen.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of time on my own. And even then, I didn't quite connect the dots. I just knew that I had gone into the forest expecting to be wedded to the wild, and I'd come out wedded to Christ. And both of them were kind of simpatico. It's very hard for me to put things like this into conventional language.
Yeah. Well, you're doing very well.
Yeah.
Thanks, bless you.
Yeah. Where did the wedded to Christ, where did your mind set, oh, this is Jesus. This isn't abstract. This has a name.
Good.
He has a name.
Well, good question. Somehow I knew. I knew. And you know what's interesting about it is one of the things I've had to adapt to as a Christian is to move from, venerating and appreciating a God that moves through all of creation, rocks, rivers, trees, and a being that also stands outside of creation, even outside of the universe, can do both at once, is in there with us. I mean, the wonderful thing for me about God is that God has a dog in the race, his own son. He has a dog in the race. There aren't many mythological figures that go, guess what? I'm going to put my son in this mosh pit and see what happens to him. And it's the most extraordinary act of love. So catastrophic in its beauty. We're still in shock 2,000 years later. What a swoon. But anyway, to answer your question was, I knew, but I didn't want to know. I knew, but I didn't want to know. I called it the mossy face of Christ. You know, it was something that I needed time to, I needed time.
Was that partly because there's a certain humility involved in coming back to the genesis of your time at home, as it were? That it was, you didn't want to go back to something that you felt was inhibiting in that sense, because as you say, the picture you had of Christianity growing up didn't seem to be a freeing, soul-feeding thing.
No.
But you knew that this was what you were being asked to go into, but obviously you were going to discover it anew in that sense.
Yes. And I mean, you know, Paul of Tarsus went awfully quiet, didn't he, for a bit before he becomes Paul that we know. Now, I do not compare myself to Paul, if N.T. Wright is listening, you know, but I understand, like, a big thing.
Yeah.
A big thing shuts you up.
Yeah.
And a big thing shut me up.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
And, you know, you suddenly have no, what would be the word? You know, there's no handrails in an experience like this. And clearly, this is not a slow intellectual exercise that brought me back into the fold. This is an absolutely extraordinary encounter with forces I barely have words for. But the thing that I think I was aware of at the time is I thought maybe it was as if God had done this to me till I was 50 and then went, now, I want you to see me now. And by the time it happened, you see, I had all of these languages at my disposal that I'd never have at Upton Vale Baptist Church.
Yeah.
I wouldn't think in that way. I wouldn't be shaped in that way. What would those churches, what would Spring Harvest have done to William Blake? Think on, you know, it's a shocker. Now, it's not that these places aren't productive and wonderful in their way, but there are artists out there and there are people that think in strange ways and they see the face of God in animals and like Wallace Black Elk, you know. Wallace said a thing to me though in the Sweat Lodge. He leaned forward and he said, don't give up on the hippie guy. And he said he was here too, talking about Christ.
Yeah.
And he said, he hasn't given up on you. Don't give up on him.
Wow.
And again, I just didn't want to hear that.
Did you lose any respect though in the course of putting a name and a person into the picture? Because in a sense, I think up to that point, you were able to be sort of quite general, you know, it was quite numinous. You didn't have to land in a particular postcode, as you say.
No.
Did kind of saying, okay, turns out that there is a face and a name to this thing. Did it lose you a few friends along the way?
Yes, it did. And it was worse than anger, disappointment.
Yeah.
Oh, that is weird.
I'm not angry. I'm disappointed. And it was, the climate has changed rapidly, but actually then there was no safety net for what I was going to do. But even reading the Gospels, I knew that was something Christ never provides that. He never provides those kinds of insurance policies. He raises the bar so high, you know, it's one way or the other. And so I knew the stakes, and I'd seen it in my own family's lives. But I lost people that were interested in publishing me. I lost a couple of close friendships. Most heartbreakingly for me, friends of mine in First Nations, Native American communities said, come on, you know, this is the religion of Trump. This is just a colonial expression of people that hate women, hate nature, hate everything that isn't just this extroverted me thing. Terrible. So that was a lot of wallop to take in those fledgling months.
And where did you find a community though that you could share that new journey with?
Well, I was sort of reluctant to come out of the woods, to be honest, because I thought, you know, there's a lot going on in here. Yeah. But I knew the notion that, you know, you want to find a room in the church building. And I'd been to see the Baptists and I liked the Baptists, and I'd been to see the Catholics and I liked the Catholics. I'd been to see the Anglicans and I liked the Anglicans. It was all very nice, but I don't need nice. I just don't need it. I need something a bit more exacting. something that demands more of me, something that is not taking its cues from a culture that does not care for it. And I found that in Eastern Orthodoxy. I was wandering around a shopping centre, believe it or not, in Exeter. And in the middle of the shopping centre, there's no roof to this thing. There was this old red stone building. It's the oldest Christian building in Exeter. And I just happened to walk in the middle of something called Divine Liturgy. And it was the transformative church Christian experience of my life. There was a father who didn't seem remotely interested in how I was doing. I grew up, you see, with a very intimate version of Jesus. How are you doing?
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah. You know, tired. Let it out. Let it out.
The seeker-sensitive Jesus.
Yeah, all of this. It was just one long back rub. And suddenly, now in poetry, you see, this sounds a bit abstract, but stay with me. In poetry, you have lyric and epic poems. Lyric poems are very personal, confessional, me. Epic is when your story gets amplified into something much bigger. And I wonder in the West if we've had an awful lot of lyric Christianity. And I'm really done with it. It's not that I don't want an intimate relationship with Jesus, but there's just something in there that's beginning. It never worked for me. Whereas the Orthodox thing, which seems from the outside probably a bit more remote, rather strange, it feeds me in a different type of way. And the liturgy of it, the beauty of it. I grew up in a Christianity that I think was a bit suspicious of beauty. Not sure about the old beauty. Could be leading you to hell, you know. Whereas actually, I think, you know, Jesus sprinkled a lot of God sprinkled a lot of beauty into this world for us to enjoy. So anyway, the long story is I found a home with Orthodoxy. And interestingly, Paul Kingsnorth is over in Ireland with the Romanians. I'm of a sort of a Russian variety, not a popular moment for that. And it just keeps feeding me and keeps getting deeper.
Wow.
I am having so much fun. I keep forgetting that I'm supposed to be asking you questions. I could just sit and soak it up all afternoon. When you say it's feeding you, it's still feeding you. And there's obviously so much about you that it's like your heart has been softened by experiential experiences, for want of a better word. How have you partnered that up with an intellectual seeking and an intellectual feeding?
Yes. Well, actually, I do. I mean, I'm a natural, you know, I've done a PhD and all of that. I'm well versed in theology and philosophy and all of that stuff. Interestingly, Father Beforius, who is my spiritual father, said, don't go too quickly with that. He said, he said, that stuff can in the end defend you against having a religious experience. If you have a propensity, which I do, to hit the books and to start nutting it all out too quick, you are very quickly standing at a distance from something that a minute ago you were firmly in the grip of. I read a lot of Russian theologians from the mid-20th century who were all on the run from the communists and all ended up in Paris at the same time at a particular seminary. Their work is not very well known over here, but it's tremendously nourishing. Also a great emphasis on Sophia, so wisdom and feminine principles and things like that I'm interested in. So that's what I do. I don't just wander around in the euphoria of the Divine Liturgy, much as I'd like to.
Yeah, that does sound like a dream.
I mean, you described that when you had this moment, and Paul Kingsnorth had a rather similar journey, as you said, it was uncharted territory at that point. But you've noticed in the last few years, suddenly a lot of other people coming out of the woodwork, talking in similar ways, not necessarily having quite the same experience, but suddenly it's not completely crazy to talk in the way you've just talked, in the way that you might have been laughed out of the room.
Oh, yes.
10 or 15 years ago.
Yes.
So what are you seeing around you?
You know, it's happening so fast. Things have changed in 2 years, things have changed. So I was laughed out of the room 2 years ago. And of course, now you get figures of as much cultural significance as Nick Cave saying, yeah, of course I go to church. I'm friends with Rowan Williams, etc., etc. And you realize, my goodness, something profound is going on. And it's happening on these different levels. You've got a Tom Holland, or you've got a Jordan Peterson, who are dancing terribly near the kingdom of heaven, even if their intellect is defending them from the final submersion. So that's stimulating, that's interesting. And then out where the buses don't park, you've got me in King's North holding up the signs of Wonders End. I
know which end I'd rather.
Yeah. And so I'm one of the things I feel compelled, actually, I said this, I was at Greenbelt. You'll know what Greenbelt is. I feel something is happening. I don't know what it is. And I feel it's very rare I get a spiritual tap on the shoulder. But I do want to put this out. And it's specifically for people that are older in churches, people that are over the age of 60. In whatever is happening, don't be passive with it. Don't feel that this is something for the youngsters. And we saw the charismatic movement. We were with John Wimber. We saw all of that. We need elder folk within this process. It can't just be a sort of sibling experience. And I can't be much clearer than that. But this is what I said, don't let yourself off the hook for the older folks in churches.
I mean, many people's journeys have been likened to C.S. Lewis at various points, who sort of had an intellectual and experiential journey. What strikes me as interesting in terms of perhaps some overlap of your story with Lewis's is that he too knew his mythology, he knew his stories from history. And there was a significant moment, obviously, when he put that together with the help of J.R.R. Tolkien, when he was able to see that Christ, Jesus, was the true myth, the one in whom all those mythologies of the past and even the future would only be echoes of this true myth. Does that ring any bells with what your experience has been?
Yes, it does. The myth made fact. That's how I suppose we would think of it. Every time you look at your modern life and you see a mythic thread in it, that is a myth made fact. It happens a lot, but it happens as a Christian. It happens in the most startling form in the years of Christ's life. As I said, born a fugitive, dies an outlaw. Estranged. I mean, people don't like to talk about this, but he's not always chiming with his own family. Even his own family is struggling. You know, this is not an Olympian wandering around. Now, just to clear something up in terms of mythology in Christ, what you get from skeptics is they will tell you that there's a kind of infrastructure to Christ's life that you find in, say, Odin or Egyptian gods, or maybe even in Dionysus. Now, here's the thing. There is an architecture which you can recognize. What you have that is completely unique in the life of Jesus is where the rubber hits the road is what he said. It's what he taught. It's what he went through. There are no other gods like that. There's no other God that has a dog in the race like our one. And so that's the important thing. It is, and Lewis and Tolkien would agree with this, it's as if you're getting divine glimpses. It's like warm-up events, pinpricks of eternity through other spiritualities and mythologies that suddenly breaks into time and space in a way we understand, and you get this extraordinary thing happen. But you've got to be careful because there's a resurgence of interest, for example, in Jungian psychology, partially through Jordan Peterson and others. That's all well and good, and I know it back to front. But Christ is not an archetype, just to be clear. He's not just a figure. He's not this just sort of, he has opinions, he has thoughts, he struggles. We have to deal as Christians with the strangeness that he's completely human and completely God, and all of that is going on. So one of the concerns, I think, as the wider conversations opens, is not to thin him out to a point where he just becomes a sort of, one of a tapestry of interesting figures.
Yes.
Otherwise, there's no point in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been interested in that recently as well. And this idea of, which is interesting, but that God is at the highest value. And I'm like, well, that's quite interesting, but he's not the highest value, is he? He's God. He's, you know.
Yes, this is a language that's often used, especially, you know, by Peterson, this Jungian, the highest value in your hierarchy of values or whatever. And I have a very similar feeling to you there, Martin, that, well, it's one way of looking at God, and there might be some psychological value, but that's certainly not the end of the story, right?
No. Well, that's just blood of enchantment for me. That's, if you know what I mean. Like, that's, anyway, I won't go there. Could you just break what you just said open for us a little bit in that, what is it? Could you give an example of what is it about Jesus as a mythologist where you get to it and you're like, oh, hang on, that breaks archetype. That's not what I'm expecting. That's not what we've been told. Are there examples of where Jesus is quite disorienting?
Yes, I will. First of all, one of the words that are being bandied about a lot these days is the word pagan. You know, there is a sense somehow that there's a sort of a new a paganism amongst us. But I say, like C.S. Lewis said, "Oh, bright vision, were it so," because really most of us need to become pagans for a while to become Christians. I like the idea we might be living in a pre-Christian society.
Yes.
I wonder if we haven't really given it a crack yet.
Rather than post-Christian, pre-Christian.
We'll have to change our intro. Listen.
But going back to what you were saying, which was
disorienting.
Yes, here we are. So in Homer's Odyssey, there's a moment where this main character Odysseus goes to the underworld and he has a conversation with Achilles, Brad Pitt. You know, and he says to Achilles, "How are you doing down in the underworld? How's this working out for you?" Yeah. And Achilles says, "Sooner be slave to a poor man than king of the underworld. It means nothing." And what he means by this is very important. It's this word kleos. Kleos in the Greco-Roman pagan world means imperishable glory. And in a pagan world, imperishable glory is the thing that you want. Now, the interesting thing about kleos is that you can't just have it in yourself. You can't just feel good about yourself and say, I have kleos, I have imperishable glory. It has to be given to you. The reason it's so important is it's the one things that humans have that the gods do not, because they never die. So they don't need imperishable glory. Okay. The pathos, and you find this in all the Greek myths, the pathos is always with the human characters. It's never with the gods. The gods are there for comic value. They're there to be frightening. But never, ever does a god give you the Sermon on the Mount. Never, ever do you hear the Beatitudes. And when you hear that stuff, the hair just starts to go up on the back of your neck because you're hearing something that seems so countercultural, so counterintuitive to the way we are designed to behave, seemingly, in a dog-eat-dog world. Yeah. So right there and then. So I always say you hear a foreshadowing of Christ in the middle of the Odyssey. The last shall be first. As soon as Achilles, who's the greatest kleos of all, says, do you know what? This isn't working for me anymore. You can hear the druid is coming.
I love it. You've started to write a book, which we'd love to have you back to talk about when it comes out. But as I understand it, it's on the dream of Christianity.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, it works with the premise that Christianity has forgotten that it's a dream.
Okay.
And it's not the kind of dream when you've eaten too much cheese. It's not the kind of dream where you're talking to your mother and she becomes a sofa. Yeah. It's the kind of dream that you have when you wake up and say, I have to change my life. I think that Christianity, I said this earlier on, has become so cautious. It's become not, this is sounding too blanket, but it has become, when you are taking your cues from a culture that has amnesia or hostility to you, you're lost. You're just absolutely lost. You're selling the farm. And so the book really is about the notion that Christianity could remember it's a dream again. So C.S. Lewis, who we mentioned earlier, has a great image in his first book, Pilgrim's Regress, first book of prose anyway, where he says Christianity in the way we understand it has several components, that we walk the road of the Jewish people. But also alongside that are some of the really big pictures that what he calls the landlord was put into the minds of the pagans. And it's this combination. And from that comes what Lewis calls Mother Kirk. But tied in with this arrangement, almost inevitably, is every few hundred years, Mother Kirk starts to sort of collapse on herself. And the landlord starts to bring the big pictures back, and people start to talk. And from the depths of the ashes, a little green shoot comes, and the church refines itself again. But there's always plenty of drama in the process. Well, I read that and I thought, I would slightly tune up what Lewis said, actually. I don't think it's pictures, I think it's dreams. And I think that in the Middle Ages, a dream would have been chivalry, the notion of noblesse oblige, that if you are noble, you have to act noble. That's a Christian ideal. That's not a pagan notion. The pagan notion is kleos. And that is why we are beginning to live in a pagan age again, because we live in an age of imperishable glory. And the gods that we worship and the place we put our attention is here, 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 here. We are ourselves talking back to ourselves. There's no God code. There's no service code. There's nothing that is bigger than us. And that is going to make you absolutely miserable. So the book that I am writing is bringing everything that I've learned about the process of trying to get made as a human being, everything that I've learned about mythology and story, and finally bringing it to the story I could not bear to tell. That's what the book is.
Yeah. There's so much to ask you about that. There's so many questions. I think when you dream in particular, what I find really interesting about the biblical authors, although this is, that spans centuries, so I'm really sweeping, but is that in those places, those visionary places, those dreams, those visions, those out-of-body experiences, there's a real sense in the Bible, in biblical literature, that those are the places we trust. Because it's in those places that our biases and our baggage, our perspectives, our experiences are parked, and God can get to us. He can bypass those things. And of course, that's not in the air we breathe now, I don't think. So that weird dream in particular is really interesting.
And dream being different to vision. Now, the evangelicals are very good at vision.
Yeah.
They're very good at mobilize.
Yeah.
But dreaming is different. Dreaming is uncorralled. Dreaming is wild. Dreaming is holy, and it can come from a source that you didn't nut out over a table and a laptop in Hoxton. Something else happened. Now, the book deals with, in its later stages, without giving too much of the plot spoiler, how in the end do you move from a dream to a vision?
Yeah.
How does discipline become the dance partner of wildness? How do we do that? And that's something that I do. And one of the things that I do is I go through the Bible and I look at great dreaming stories. For example, remember, of course, Joseph and his funky coat. And he has these extraordinary dreams that irritate his brothers, even irritate his father. And he says, didn't I do well? And we all know he has to go through a living hell in Egypt until finally the prophecy of the dream takes place, but you never would have expected the underworld he's going to have to go through to get to that moment. And I wonder about that in our lives. I think, when you were younger, did you have glimpses of the life that may be ahead? But very few of us would have had any ideas of the Egypt we would have to pass through to get there.
And this idea that Mother Kirk has to collapse and be reborn every few hundred years. So presumably you think we might be reaching that collapse point now?
Well, put it this way, my Catholic friends are troubled at the moment. My evangelical friends and Anglican friends are troubled in their own way. It's not sunshine and light over in the Orthodox world either. I think individual parishes can be very healthy, but there's just something about power and Christianity that is trouble.
If we're in this process, if maybe we are starting to see the church start to melt down and in God's grace, perhaps something new emerge, are you and some of these other people we've talked about, are they part of this dreaming process? Is this a moment when something new is being fed in, some new pictures, some new dreams from God? What?
Yes, that's exactly what I think.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And it's something that I said a minute ago, though, is I think not to fetishize the one that's holding the microphone. It's why I said, you know, if you're in your church and over 60, well, you've been there for a while. You know, you've got past the beginner's luck that me and Paul and a few others have. You're in the difficult, you've been out in the desert with Christ by this point, not just in the oasis skipping around.
You've passed the honeymoon phase.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think if this could be a restorative movement, which I think it would, I'd ask everybody to try and take agency of it. Yeah.
On your website, there's an amazing quote about you from Rowan Williams. And if he said anything half as nice about me ever, I would die happy. He said that you are a true and transformative enchanter, which is why you are the perfect guest on Re-Enchanting. But I think, firstly, I would, as a enchanter, I would love to get a sort of a cultural read from you on this whole re-enchantment that we sort of feel in the air, and you've definitely touched upon it. But also how, if you were speaking to those people, either who are in church and have been in for a while, or who aren't, and they're in a place sort of where you have been, where they think I'm seeking and I don't know where I'll find it, but I know where I won't. And that's Christianity. What would be your advice about re-enchanting the wildness, the dream of Christianity? How do we do that?
Well, we should become saints again, or we should try to become saints. Because a saint, in one of the earliest understandings of it, was somebody by the time you left their presence, you felt different. You felt different. Forget levitation. Forget all the ornamental stuff about a saint. A saint is somebody that doesn't just give you hope, they give you rigor and they give you excitement. And so actually one of the places we could go would to be, you know, what I call Christian wonder tales. They're very ecological, actually. They've been abandoned. People don't take them seriously. But there's this amazing body of teaching you get, especially in Ireland. The thing about Ireland is when Christianity arrived there, it didn't arrive on the tip of a sword, it arrived on the tip of a tongue. There was no invading force with Christianity in Ireland. So it arrives as a conversation. Isn't that amazing? It arrives as a thought. Even though in Druidic circles, they prophesied it. They said the big Druid's coming. So get ready.
Wow.
And they were kind of ready. The Irish were like, yeah, we're ready for this. Let's do it. But in Ireland, you have green martyrhood, not red.
Right.
And the green martyrhood was people going out and becoming hermits. So I'm attracted to those old ideas again, actually, of, you know, in Orthodoxy, we call it theosis. It's, you know, moving slowly in your stumbling way. You fall into the mind of God, as Paul says it. So I think as Christians, we're so frightened of vainglory. I know that I am. I'm in a terrible profession in terms of my own leaning into vanity. You know, it's a real thing. I've just been on tour for a month and I was like this all the way through because Jesus talks about it a lot. You know, pride is a real thing. So, but the trouble is you can then end up so meek and mild that you don't proceed in this world as if you matter at all. And that's why my kind of cry for older Christians who may be sort of moving towards the retirement end, saying, you know what, there may be a last hurrah. There may be something that you're seeing that us younger ones are not. So that would be a thought.
I guess the thing that I sort of finally come to as we start to draw this together is you don't want to kind of put this in a box, in a sense. You don't want to turn what you're describing into a 12-step program for how do we basically get this mission back on track and, you know, re-evangelize the world or whatever. And that it feels like you want to hold this lightly, that when you call it a dream, you're saying, let's not try and turn it into something. Let's just see what happens. And let's give ourselves permission to just tell stories, to sort of be imaginative almost in this moment.
You know, don't tell anybody, but I do have a lot of time for the charismatics. Don't keep this between us. Even though I'm Orthodox.
It won't go further than us two and the people listening.
I don't care for the worship music and the rest of it, to be honest. But that sense that you get with the early Christians of dynamic, exciting, plenty of Holy Spirit in the room. The thing about Orthodoxy for me is it has that, but it also has this incredible runway for the Holy Spirit to land in, which for me is the liturgy. So I do try to handle it lightly, because I'm not the repository of great wisdom, but I'm looking at it, you know, and that's where we all are. So you sell a lot more books, Justin, if you say 12 steps towards rewilding Christianity, but that will date, you know, it'll date it. And one of the things but you know, weaving and bobbing with the book that I'm writing is that it isn't just, you know, rewildingchristianity.com. It's got to last longer than that, I think. However, the sentiment behind it, I do understand. Birds need to be released from their cages, I think.
Well, I agree with Rowan Williams. You are, in fact, a true and transformative enchanter. And I've enjoyed this so much. I've too often forgotten that I'm supposed to be a part of it.
That's a good sign.
Yeah,
isn't
that's
it?
a great sign.
Yeah, with so much more we could have chatted around. Yeah. But you give me a lot of hope, Martin, not only because of your personal story, which of course is very encouraging at one level, but because, I don't know, there's just something about saying this story is sort of unstoppable. It's like we can do what we can do with our little point, but there's an epic story here. That's, you know, I love that lyric and epic poetry and story. And and I guess my hope and prayer is that we'll just play whatever part we're given in it.
I agree. And I would just say for anybody watching this to take courage. We are living in extraordinary times. Peril is ever present, but so is wonder. So is wonder. Job teaches us that, you know, our wonder eyes should be open. And could you imagine if Christians said, you know what, we're going to be praise makers. We're going to be praise makers. We're going to go out into this world and find things that seek to be admired, because our screens are keeping us in a state of almost perpetual semi-nervous breakdown at the moment. We're receiving so much bad news so incessantly than our retina. I feel like the devil has got his hands on our retinas at the moment. And it's a remarkable thing to do, to just go for a walk, find something that, as I said, is seeking to be admired by you. Give it 12 secret names. Talk to God in 12 secret ways. You know, just open up Jesus of the imagination. That's what I think.
Well, thank you so much, Martin, for re-enchanting us, re-enchanting the dream of Christianity. God bless you.
You too.